Dale Wisely. I think it was last week that early April 2020, I was scheduled to repeat my teen driving talk, which I do 2 or 3 times a year at Mountain Brook, and then I do it in other places. I've been doing this for, gosh, close to 25 years. And, here I am, staying at home, sheltered in place, whatever you call it. But I really didn't want the year to pass without giving you making this video for you so you can hear the content of this. I know some of you had waited for it, and not only as I normally would be saying that the summer is coming up, and summer is sometimes referred to as the 100 deadly days when it comes to teen driving fatalities and crashes, motor vehicle crashes. And of course, what we're into now, for all practical purposes, kind of is like a 5 or month summer or something like that. So kids are out of school, and granted, many of them are staying at home, or certainly staying home a lot more than they normally do. You may be letting your teenagers venture out for your own sanity or for theirs, but nothing about this health crisis, other than the fact that it may keep kids from driving as much, makes this problem go away, motor vehicle crashes. And so we'll go ahead and go through this material, and hope you find it worthwhile. And you be sure and email me your questions if you have any, or if you need elaboration. My email address will be on the screen. And so here we go. So, oh, by the way, the slides, if you'd like to see the slides, they're available at this link, parentingteendrivers.com no, that's a slash slides. Just keep them there in a PDF form. You're welcome to use them or refer to them or share them in any way you'd like. So, motor vehicle crashes are still the leading cause of death of teenagers and also college-age students in the United States and Alabama. But that's a little bit misleading. It's still true that motor vehicle crashes are the leading direct cause of death. In other words, what cause of death might appear on the death certificate. But alcohol and drugs are a major contributor to these deaths and to some of the other leading causes of death among teenagers, just not always a direct cause of death. And so if a motor vehicle crash occurs, the driver's been drinking, the cause of death is a motor vehicle crash, but a contributor to that, is alcohol abuse or intoxication. But it's still the #1 killer of teenagers. To that point, I just ran this data. I try to run it again every time I do the talk. This brings us up through 2018. We don't have the more recent data because it simply takes the federal government a couple of years to compile it. We'll get the 2019 data here in a couple of months. So these are the raw numbers of people aged 15 to 24. That just happens to be how the government breaks this down. 15 to 24-year-olds, so basically teenagers and college-age students. And these are the top killers. So kind of working up from the bottom, in the whole nation, we'll lose about 151 young women to complications of pregnancy, chronic low respiratory diseases, diabetes, congenital abnormalities that were always there, but eventually catch up with someone, ends their life, cancer deaths in this age group. And then you get into the big three. And the big three are homicide, suicide, and then look at unintentional injuries, which is what we used to call accidents. I think I understand that they are kind of discouraging using the term accidents in public health. I was going to say why, I can't remember why. There was a rationale for that. Doesn't matter. But the people tend now to use the term unintentional injury, and also instead of motor vehicle accidents, we tend to say now motor vehicle crashes. But you can see that those top three. And I've done talks elsewhere, continue to do talks, and do my little part to try to raise awareness of not only our suicide rates among teenagers still disturbing, but they're increasing, and they've been increasing at a rapid rate for the last 10 years, a really alarming rate. Homicide rates are actually higher than suicide rates in poor, more urban neighborhoods. Suicide would be the #2 cause of death among young people in middle class, affluent neighborhoods as a general rule. But just note that in order to get to the 12,000 teenagers and college age students we lose in this country every year to accidents, you'd have to pretty much add up all the others, all the, from complicated pregnancy all the way up to suicide. If you add all those together, that's when you match just the number of deaths that come from accidents. Now, not all of those accidents, not all those unintentional injuries are motor vehicle related, but it turns out that about 2/3 of them are. I thought I had a slide about this, but about 2/3 of unintentional injuries are vehicular. They're motor vehicle crashes. Excuse me, I'm going to increase my light here a little bit. That still means that even when you divide those accidents up into motor vehicle and non-motor vehicle, it's the motor vehicle crashes that are still the leading cause of death. Now, this is good news, which I sometimes hesitate to present only because I'd never want people to feel complacent. But there's a point to presenting this data, and the data basically tells us that over the last, 30 years, accident rates, motor vehicle crash deaths among teenagers, this group happens to be 16 to 18-year-olds, have really fallen sharply and steadily. We've had a little blip up, a little stabilization, ups and downs in the last 6 years, but it's generally been a story of these rates going down. We think that the reason for that is increased. The cars are safer. Cars are made safer. They have more safety features. That we may have made some progress in discouraging people in general and teenagers in particular from drinking and driving. We've done a lot of kind of hammering on young drivers about not driving when they're distracted and so forth. So for whatever reason, this has gotten better. So at the risk of making parents feel complacent, the reason I share this data is it tells us that we don't have to be losing all these teenagers to motor vehicle crash deaths. There are things we can do, and they have worked to bring these rates down substantially. As long as we remember, still, God forbid, if any of you is going to lose a child to death, the most likely reason for that's going to be a motor vehicle crash. And even with these improvements, that's still true. So one of the things I do and have always done in this presentation and in the website I have on this same topic is to encourage parents to have strict and written rules in place in the form of a parent-teen contract, parent-teen driving contract, and insist that their teenager not be allowed to drive until they read that contract, understand that contract, and sign that contract. that should be a condition of allowing your teenager to drive a car, is a written contract, and the contract has rules that are designed to keep them alive, keep their passengers alive, keep pedestrians alive, and so forth. In fairness, teenagers, their developmental, one of their developmental tasks is to push for the maximum amount of freedom. So they tend not, as a group, I'm generalizing, it's unforgivable, but I'm generalizing. As a group, teenagers don't like a lot of restrictions. They like to be able to make their own decisions. And so it's likely that a teenager, if you try to be stricter than most people, most parents, and do a parent-teen driving contract with strict rules, your teenager is going to do everything they can to defeat that, to keep you from doing it, to talk you out of it, accuse you of being the craziest and meanest parents in a 5-county area, tell you nobody else is doing this, which, in a way is closer to being the truth. Most parents don't take teen driving as seriously as they should. And I would suspect that even after 25 years of regularly doing this talk in Mountain Brook, I'm convinced that, I know that the majority of parents, still don't do it, don't do a contract. And it's not about my contract or my rules. It's just that I think most parents would fall short of, I don't mean to be judgmental, but of taking this as seriously as they should and having the kind of rules in place that can help save their child's life. But anyway, your teenager is going to really turn on the pressure. And also, you, as parents, we're just busy and stressed and don't like to stay on top of something like this all the time. All this to say, there's all kinds of things that will attack a parent's resolve to do the right thing when it comes to teen driving. And so I've always recommended that to keep our motivation and to continue to do the right thing and to be kind of a strict parent about driving, we just have to close our eyes and ask ourselves what's at stake. And what's at stake is the lives of our children. What's at stake is not having to bury our own baby, which is, let's be honest, that's what this is. It's not just about that. So, what's at stake? Ask yourself that question when you feel your resolve. So what is at stake? Well, I mentioned, of course, the ultimate thing would seem to be having to bury your own child, but there are other things. Motor vehicle crashes are easily the leading cause of disabling injuries, traumatic brain injuries, spinal cord injuries. By far, motor vehicle crashes would be the thing most likely to hand you a child with an injury that's disabled them and dramatically disabled them. So if you can't think about your child dying, that's just too much to bear, then back up a little bit and think about, sitting in an intensive care unit someplace, waiting to see if your child's going to wake up, or waiting to see if they're going to be able to move their fingers and toes, or walk again, or if they're going to have a brain injury that causes permanent difficulties. That's all, that's, when you think about it, that's happening right now. It's to at least one person, maybe probably a few people in Jefferson County, even in the middle of this pandemic. I'm sure there are parents someplace in that very situation with their teenagers, in the hospital. I just had a serious motor vehicle crash and waiting to see, whether they're looking at a disability. If that's too much to bear, then you might back up a little bit and think about, what if your teenager was responsible for an accident in which other people were killed. This also happens. It's happened in Mountain Brook. It's happened in Homewood. It's happened in Vestavia. There's no community where this hasn't happened, where a teenager, sometimes a good kid, is responsible for an accident in which people are injured or die. So this case, I collected this photograph many years ago. I don't know where I found it. I'm sure on the internet. I do remember the backstory to this was this teenager, this boy was a senior in high school, and as their senior year was winding down, I think they were, I don't know if it was prom or a party or something, but he was out with some friends. He was driving. He had had something to drink, and he was responsible for an accident. He himself was not badly injured. I think one of his friends was killed. Two others were badly injured. And he was convicted for probably vehicular homicide or some charge like that. This is his mother, saying goodbye to him before he's let off to go to a state prison, wherever this is. That's a real thing, real within the realm of possibilities in good families. Going back to that slide, I've often said that if you can't picture yourself in that photograph saying goodbye to your child before they go to prison, then with all due respect, you just have no imagination, because that could happen to really, you could happen to any of us. Now, this is important for me to go over this briefly. In talking about teenagers and driving, we need to be fair and respectful. So this image is kind of the opposite of that. You get a lot of these things. We say a lot of things about teenagers that frankly just aren't true, or are just generalizations. Like, what is wrong with these reckless teenagers? All these teenagers are reckless. And I don't think that's fair. And I also don't think it really fits the fact. So it's a shame we're not in a room together. We'll do it this way though. So I'm going to pose this question to you. I've been posing for a long time when I do this talk live, and that is that you raise your hand. You can raise your hand wherever you're viewing this video. That you raise your hand if you believe it is probably true that if you are using your cell phone while driving a car, it increases the chances that you'll have an accident. Now, I will tell you, when I do this in a room, everybody raises their hand. Everybody raises their hand to acknowledge that, yes, they understand that by using their cell phone when they're driving, they're increasing the risk of a crash. Then the second question is, raise your hand if you sometimes use your cell phone when you're driving. So we should review and think about what this means, because I'm going to say, I wish I'd kept numbers, wish I'd kept a count over the years, but I'd say 90% of people in the audience for this talk acknowledge that it's a dangerous thing to do and that they do it. And so when we say, I'm going to be blunt, when we say, yes, I know it increases the chances I'll have an accident. Well, that really means that it means increasing the chances that you'll be responsible for an accident because of distracted driving, in which maybe you slam into another vehicle and end the life of a young mother or a child or anyone. And so I ask you, why in the world would we continue to engage in a behavior using our cell phone when we're driving that increases the chances, not just that we would be in an accident that bangs up our car or injures us, but that we could kill somebody, graveyard dead, for no reason other than we were distracted by our phone. So, In fairness, this is not a teenager. Um, and we see this kind of thing. The flip phone there tells you how old this picture is. But here we have somebody who's talking on the phone, eating breakfast and drinking coffee. In fairness to her, she's not putting on makeup. Could add that in. So this is dangerous. And why? It takes our minds off of the road, takes our minds off the task of driving, which is probably the most important part of this. That's the highest risk. Contributor to the risk is that we have, a finite amount of mental attention, and we're devoting it to all kinds of things other than driving. And that pulls away from the attention we should be paying to driving. It also can take our eyes off the road. That's true. And it can take our hands off the wheel. That's true. But it really does appear to be that probably the most important aspect of this is we're not fully concentrating on the task of driving. So since we see, you and I, back in the old days when we were allowed to go out and drive, before quarantine, you've seen this. So you've seen variations of this. You see it almost every day. You certainly see people driving around talking on their phones, and you see people eating. And I still always remember I was driving to Montgomery many years ago, that long stretch, between Birmingham and Montgomery. And a guy on the left passed me, and I looked over, and I literally did a double take, if not a triple take. Guy was driving, I guess he was driving with his knee on the steering wheel. He was playing a clarinet, driving down the road. I couldn't help but think, man, if that guy's airbag deploys, it would not be good. Slam that clarinet right through the medulla, which, trust me, I'm a doctor. You use your medulla all the time. It's pretty important. So the point of this is, it's not entirely fair to say what's wrong with these reckless teenagers. Teenagers have not cornered the market on reckless behavior. It's a much larger problem than just teenagers. We already know that adults have easily caught up with teenagers in terms of like texting while driving. Adults text while driving now as much as teenagers do. I also have had this in my collection of photographs for a long time. You can see this is 280 and or is that 30? Yeah, it's 280 and Mountain Brook Office Park, right? And so I have this sedan here, and I don't know if you can see it, but this guy's rocking a laptop. Now that's not a teenager. How do I know that's not a teenager? A, no teenager would be caught dead driving that vehicle. B, it's a laptop. How, it's like, that's so 2009. So there you go. Now you might ask, what am I doing? Who took this photograph, and what are they doing driving down the road taking photographs? That's fair. But you can see the wheels here. The car has stopped in traffic. But anyway, I'd like to share. Teenagers take unnecessary risk when they drive, and so do their parents, and so do all of us. Now, this is an important point. It's really the first one I've made so far. Teenagers do take more risks than other drivers, than adult drivers. But teenagers mostly take greater risks when they have other teenage passengers with them. And as I'll show you later, the presence and the number of teenage passengers in the car with a teenage driver is an incredibly important factor. It's a major driver, no pun intended, of motor vehicle crashes involving not only a teenage driver, but multiple teenagers, because you have passengers in the car. And I'll show you that data in just a minute. So that's really a critical thing. We all take too many risks. Teenagers tend to take more risks than adult drivers, but that tends to be related to the distraction and some misbehavior that goes on when they have teenagers in the car. We'll get back to that. So Alabama, for many years, has had what's called a graduated license law. The term graduate is a little confusing because we tend to think of graduation in terms of high school graduation, college graduation. In this case, graduation means gradual stages. So I'm going to go over this. I think most, I guess it's true, pardon me. I'm not sick, but I've got seasonal allergies. By the way, there's a great thing on Facebook that said when there's a pandemic involving an upper respiratory or a lower respiratory disease, and you have seasonal allergies, every day is like you cough or you think, okay, am I going to be dead in 2 weeks, or do I just need to take a Claritin? Sorry, I don't mean to make light of it, but that's kind of a dilemma for us allergy sufferers. I think most probably reasonably tuned in parents in Alabama know that there's some kind of Alabama graduated licensing law, but I've learned from experience and that most people don't know what's in it. And so we're going to talk about what's in it. This is the law in Alabama. So the graduated licensing law means that if you're 16, you get a different kind of license, which applies as long as you're 16. So it places restrictions on new drivers. All drivers, it's not really new drivers, it's based on age. So all 16-year-old drivers, these restrictions apply to 16-year-old drivers as long as they're 16 years old. There's a myth that pops up around here that if you're 16, once you've been licensed for 6 months, the restrictions are lifted. That's not true. These restrictions on 16-year-old drivers are in place as long as they're 16. Furthermore, these restrictions could apply to some 17-year-olds, particularly those who have been licensed for less than 6 months. So let's say a teenager, for whatever reason, are later in getting their license, and so they're 17 now, but they've been licensed, pardon me, less than 6 months. Then these restrictions still apply to them, and that's probably where the confusion comes in. Does not apply to 18-year-olds, period. So it applies to all 16-year-olds and some 17-year-olds, those 17-year-olds who've been licensed for less than 6 months. And here are the restrictions. There's a curfew, and the curfew is 7 days a week, and it's midnight to 6 a.m. If you're 16, you're not to be out driving. There are exceptions, unfortunately. One exception is if you have a parent or an adult who's 21 years old or over in the car, a 16-year-old could be driving during the curfew. If they're going to or from work, if they're going to or from something that's school or religiously oriented, they can be driving after curfew. If it's an emergency, now the emergency is not, my friend Amanda is broken up with Brandon. That's not, and I've got to get to her, that's not an emergency. An emergency has to involve flashing emergency lights, right? And then my favorite exception is it doesn't apply to people who want to be hunting or fishing between midnight and 6 a.m. So, yeah. So teenagers, let's say 3 or 4 teenage boys out someplace get stopped and 2 o'clock in the morning and 4 o'clock in the morning, and the sheriff's deputy says, "What are you boys doing out?" They get to say, "Oh, it's okay. We have guns." So I think you do have to have your hunting license or your fishing license with you. So that's the curfew. Curfew, those are the exceptions to the curfew, but there is a curfew. Passenger limit, and this is probably one of the real keys to this, definitely is. Causes a lot of confusion. When a 16-year-old is driving, they may have no more than one passenger. Now that does not apply to family members. So you could have a 16-year-old driver who transports his 3 sisters to their soccer practice. That's okay. You could have a parent in the car and a couple of kids. But what it really applies to is loading the car up with your friends. So it would be illegal for a 16-year-old driver to take 2 friends to the football game or to the mall or whatever, but to school. You really should not have a carpool where a 16-year-old is driving and has more than one student passenger. That would be against the law. So that's the passenger limit, 1 passenger, as long as they're 16. And they may not use a handheld communication device while driving. Now it's unlawful in Alabama, it's unlawful for all of us to use our phones, or any of us, to text while driving or do anything, like this. I'm sorry, like this. That's against the law. But for 16-year-olds, they're not supposed to use their telephones at all, unless they use Bluetooth or other hands-free technology, which, by the way, as we'll talk about in a minute, does not make people safer drivers. Hands-free technology does not improve safety. This has been researched pretty thoroughly. But the laws, virtually all laws about distracted driving, make exceptions for Bluetooth and other handheld technology. People ask all the time, is this law enforced? And the answer is it has very low enforcement rates. It's not the most practical set of laws, but it is a law. And believe it or not, there are teenagers who actually try to obey the law. So I still think it's good to have this on the books. It's a teaching tool. It's also a tool for parents. A parent can say, well, it doesn't matter whether I give you permission to take 2 of your friends to the summit, because the law says you can. You're 16 years old. So it's not useless, but it is hard to enforce. And there's probably very little actual enforcement of this. If it does get enforced, by the way, the penalty is to extend out the amount of time these restrictions apply. There's also provisions in it for fines. But frankly, this law is always going to be of limited value unless law enforcement folks can figure out a way to enforce it. I know that's not easy. But I do wonder if even if just periodically, they did a little brief campaign on a weekend to try to actually enforce it. I don't know. I'm not in law enforcement, and I shouldn't be presumptuous about that. But now, all that said, there's very clear and abundant research that states that have these laws in place, that these laws do reduce teenage motor vehicle crashes. They do. I mean, you can see it. The states that have them, all kinds of ways to make comparisons between places that do have them and don't have them. And the evidence seems to add up to saying that it does save lives, these laws, even though the enforcement is such